Good morning, everybody. I hope they've turned the mics on. I'm Ernie Bauer. I'm the chair for Southeast Asia Studies, and for today, wearing my other hat as director of our Pacific Partners Initiative, which looks out over U.S. policy and our relationships with Australia, New Zealand, and the Pacific. We have a great discussion today. This is part of a U.S.-Australia speaker series that was developed in concert with our friends from BHP. I think Frank Fannin and Jason are here. I hope they are. Oh, there they are. Thanks, guys, for your support. And I think the purpose of this series was to really dig deeper into the real value and grist of the U.S.-Australia relationship. That alliance is one that is really important to both our countries, and I would argue to all of the Indo-Pacific region. And today we get to talk about really the foundation, I think, a key part of that foundation, which is the economic relationship between our countries and what the United States and Australia see in terms of trade. This is the 10th anniversary, of course, of the Australia-U.S. Free Trade Agreement. That's a very important benchmark, and I hope our discussants will talk a little bit about that. And of course, we're in the midst of negotiating a new trade agreement, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, or TPP, and we have the two incredible advocates for that trade agreement with us here. Let me introduce our guest. Wendy Cutler is the acting deputy U.S. Trade Representative. Wendy's worked with USTR for about a quarter of a century. She is the woman. Sorry, Wendy. Does 25 years sound better? Look, it's by way of saying that Wendy, when it comes to Asian trade, I think I've always thought of one of the areas in the U.S. government where powerful women have been ahead of their time is trade, and Wendy is one of those. She is probably the woman when it comes to trade in Asia, and we really have appreciated her work and her tireless commitment to those efforts. And on my right is Kim Beazley. He's the Australian ambassador to the United States. His tour has been extended here, and that's a great thing for the relationship. We really, talking with Kim at any time is like getting it's fun, but it's also like getting a university lecture at a PhD level, and on the history and the purpose behind our relationship. So you're in for a treat today. Kim has been ambassador here since, I think, 2010. He came on a day that looked pretty much like today. Or a week that looked pretty much like today in February in 2010. So without further ado, let's kick it off. I hope, audience, that I want to thank the hardy souls that made it through the inch or so of snow. That's major snow for those of you in Boston. Sorry, but that's major snow for Washington. We have a full room, and I know that the online audience today is especially big. So thank you all for joining us. I hope you'll send in your questions if you're virtual via Twitter. And for those of you in the room, I hope you'll participate actively. So Kim, why don't we kick off with you and what's on your mind in the context that we just...
Well, what's on my mind, Ernie, is you describing me as an incredible representative for Australia. I hope it would be credible. But the other thing that's on my mind is how terrific it is to be here, and to thank you for the enormous work that you do in focusing this town on the areas where America now needs to be most heavily concerned, and which I describe as the sunny uplands of American possibilities. The one area of the globe which is both wealthy, is growing fast, and loves Americans. And it's nice to have a part of the globe where you can say that happens to be the case. And bound up in all of that, of course, is the economic relationship and the various manifestations of it and trading arrangements. And this is part of your speakers series that you've negotiated with BHP Billiton, and that's terrific for us. It's a great thing for BHP to have, the big Australian, to have got in behind. Big Australian, has to be said, does with its partners 25% of the oil out of the Gulf, and is the largest foreign investor in unconventional energy in this country. So they're good spots. And to appear with Wendy is a bit of a legend from USTR. I didn't know much about USTR when I came here as an ambassador, because my relationships in ministerial life had been with the Pentagon in the first instance and the State Department after that. They're different sort of Americans in USTR. They're the ones who carry the bad messages and the hard messages, and they really do defend the American national interest extremely well. But at the same time, they have, like most Americans, a sense of global responsibility, so they do temper their views with that understanding of what America's global role now is. I think we'd have to count the bilateral agreement. This is the 10th anniversary, as Ernie said, of the bilateral agreement that we established for free trade between Australia and the United States. It would have to be in the minds, I think, of just about anybody who has looked at American trade policies over the years and trade outcomes. It has to be just about the most successful agreement that the United States has negotiated, when you look at the outcomes that have been associated with it. It was an agreement that was based upon a very strong public sentiment between the countries, and at that point of time, a very close relationship between the leadership of Australia and the leadership of the United States. We're always asked when we're in jobs like mine, and particularly if we have a political background like I do, you know, who represents the closest, who has represented the closest point in relations on a personal basis between leaders of Australia and leaders of the United States. That's a benchmark in Australia. It's not a benchmark in the US, but it is a benchmark in Australia. And I suppose I would have to say that though he was my political nemesis, that probably the relationship between John Howard and the American leadership at the time was the closest that there's actually ever been on a personal basis in relations between the two countries. So this trade agreement has to be said, a bit of an outflow, if you like, from what that situation was then. It produced a very high quality agreement between us. I mean, there are elements of it which are, on the American side, they see as flawed, and the extent to which in the medical area or IP, the length of time that IP gets protected. In the case of Australia, what has been an agreement which covered off pretty well open access to just about everything, still has flaws in relation to sugar and one or two other elements of agriculture. And I might say, as a sort of foreign friend of the United States, you can get overly protective in this area when you look at the opportunities, particularly in the Asian region, that are before you. When you see in Asia, where there are 580 million members of the middle class now, going to 3.2 billion over the course of the next 15 years. And when you see that in the first instance, what people buy as they go middle class is not bling, mobile phones and the like. What they buy is food. They change their food consumption, moving more heavily towards meat, moving more heavily towards wheat-based product, when you're dealing with a situation in Asia. So there's American farmers can look at the future. We're not talking about the TPP, at least not yet. But I mean, what an opportunity. You know, you don't want to nitpick when you're looking at an opportunity to see decent, high-quality rules for access for your product in a region where they are absolutely going to be screaming for food, new food products over the next 15 years. I put that as an aside. It was an area where there's a bit of a flaw, I think, in the free trade agreement. But what a set of outcomes. In the 10 years, trade between Australia and the United States has almost doubled. Now, a lot in Australia would be mildly critical of that because while it has doubled, it is pretty evident that the principal beneficiary of it has been, in direct terms, the United States, where there's a 24 billion trade balance in their favour. I don't think the US has a trade balance of a significant proportion better than that with anyone. So some people in Australia say, hey, look at that, that's not a good thing. But when you actually look in the inwardness of the thing, both in the trade area and investment, you see that the two elements of that free trade agreement coming through, and that is it's made it easier for the United States to supply the kit and the cash for what has been the boom area in Australian exports. It's probably not well known, but the fourth largest trading partner of the President's home state is Australia, basically because Illinois produces humongous amounts of mining kit. And that ends up in Australia. That has been underpinning the huge development of Australian mining operations, but particularly in the LNG area. And then investment. That is the extraordinary story of the free trade agreement. You've got a situation now where direct and indirect, the US invests about $650 billion in Australia. Probably, now that's interesting. It's more than the US invests in China. But the location of the areas where it invests, the US is investing, is in those areas which are leading elements of Australia's export performance. That's one thing that's interesting. The second thing that's interesting is, and I think more interesting, is the impact it's had on Australian investment in the United States. It's now up to $470 billion, and it's growing at the rate of about $30 billion a year. That's direct and indirect. Australian companies are surging to the United States on a highway made so much easier by the free trade agreement that was put in place. You know, the tap doesn't get turned on overnight when a free trade agreement like that gets put in place. So 10 years looking back is a good vantage point to actually do that. Yeah. And so we can. And what we can see is that it has facilitated enormously investment both ways, as well as, of course, trade both ways. So it's hard for me to admit I'm actually a sort of global free trader. Where we came from and the governments I served in the 1980s tended to see multilateral regional and bilateral agreements as essentially trade diversionary. And we were WTO people, big time. What we've really got to get in place is a system of global free trade. We took enormous political risks to try to get that position in place. But I've had anyway, personally, to temper my assessment on when you sit down and take a look at what the impact of these bilateral agreements has been. The government signed up to 3 recently, and they look to be really good quality agreements. South Korea, China, and Japan. And now with the TPP potentially forthcoming, they will produce something like those sorts of economic outcomes. So I'd have to say, and as I said, there are areas where there'll be disputation on some of the points I made in an Australian context, looking at the operation of the free trade agreement. This has been an enormous success, and those who negotiated can be proud of what they achieved.
Well, let me turn to somebody who did have a role in that agreement. Wendy, I'd love to hear your perspective on things.
Well, thank you very much, Ernie, and thank you very much, Ambassador Beasley. I really enjoyed your comments. And just listening to you, it really led me to have a moment of reflection that often at USTR, even though we may be a little different than other people in the United States, we do operate at a very, very busy and sometimes frenetic pace. And we don't have opportunities really to sit and reflect on what we achieved in these trade agreements and how things have changed and what has happened over a period of the agreement. So to have a session like this 10 years later, to really not only look and describe what was in the US-Australia agreement, but really what has happened to our economic relationship since that time. And in that regard, I would just endorse everything that Ambassador Beasley has said about the US-Australia Free Trade Agreement. It's really an agreement we would call win-win. When we embarked on this negotiation in the early 2000s, Australia was one of the biggest trading partners that we approached. It was after our free trade agreement negotiation with Singapore, and then we moved on to Australia. And there were a lot of challenges in this negotiation. I know for Australia, there was some criticism at that time about certain aspects of the negotiation, as well as in the United States. But our trade negotiators were really able to work very hard and closely together to really shape a very meaningful agreement that not only produced and led to a tremendous increase in trade between the two countries, but also, as Ambassador Beasley has mentioned, enormous investment flows between the two countries as well. From the US perspective, we look at this free trade agreement and we consider it to be one of our most successful free trade agreements. And we point to the increase in trade, but also the increase in US exports, which increased by 91% over the past 10 years. We also note that we're the #1 investor in Australia now. And we also note what we call some of these intangible benefits of trade agreements. And that is that much of our trade and investment is now driven by very high value-added goods and services that really rely on the innovative abilities of our exporters from both countries. And the growing interconnectedness of our supply chains between our countries has really supported the exchange of capital, of technology, and the free flow of goods and services, and that has further served to deepen our economic relationship. Actually, I think a decade of our subsequent agreements demonstrates how much we accomplished in 2004, and the bilateral data really show an important and impressive story. I would note that I know that there has been some criticism in Australia that Australia runs a bilateral deficit with us, but when you really look at what comprises that is that Australia can argue that the deficit they have with us really fuels their surpluses with their Asian trading partners. And that's a really, I think, important aspect of this agreement and really shows this notion of supply chains, looking at where the competitiveness and complementary natures of our economies lie. Now, 10 years later, we find ourselves again working very hard together, but working hand in hand. And I remind myself that before Japan joined the TPP a year and a half ago, the US and Australia were the largest two economies in TPP. We have both individually and jointly played a very important leadership role in the TPP negotiations. And I would argue, I think that's really reflects the strong and deep economic cooperation and ties that we have developed since the US-Australia FTA came into effect. The Peterson Institute did a study, and many of you heard the statistics of what they point to in terms of US benefits from TPP, including an increase of US exports of $123 billion every year. And it also points to an increase of Australian exports as well, of a more limited nature, but Australia does have FTAs with a lot of the TPP partners, except for, I think, Canada, Mexico, and Peru. But I would also argue that through the TPP, Australia really has the opportunity to gain more market access and to gain more benefits from the rules that are negotiated with countries where they already have FTAs, because the TPP will build on many of their FTA commitments to date, particularly with countries like Japan. In terms of TPP, I'm sure you're all wondering where the negotiations stand today. And let me just briefly turn back the clock to December when the APEC leaders got together in Beijing, in November, and President Obama and Prime Minister Abbott and other TPP leaders took note of the tremendous progress that our negotiators have made and really committed themselves to concluding this deal as soon as possible, recognizing the importance of getting the strategic and economic benefits that this agreement will provide in place as soon as possible. And since that time, we've been working very hard at all levels of the negotiations. We have been meeting in small groups in certain issue areas. We've had a chief negotiators meeting in November, and our chief negotiators are about to take off for Hawaii next week. And all of the momentum that was really provided from the APEC leaders meeting continues to provide opportunities to build on the momentum at these various meetings. In the meantime, the United States and Japan have been working very hard on our bilateral negotiations, both on agriculture and market access, but also the automotive issues, and we've been making good progress with Japan as well. And finally, I think our TPP partners have taken note of really the stepped-up debate in Washington on trade, both in the administration at the highest levels, but also in our Congress. We've explained to our TPP partners that TPA is a domestic procedure, just like our TPP partners have domestic procedures, like an election, like a change in government, and we will deal with that domestically. But we also know that as our TPP partners contemplate challenging political decisions that TPP will require, that other TPP countries are encouraged to see that trade is appearing poised to move forward in Congress. And once again, this has provided even additional momentum to the negotiations, which we are continuing to build on. So once again, our negotiators will be leaving for Hawaii. They will continue to make as much progress as they can in narrowing the outstanding issues and really trying to be in a place to have the set of issues where political decisions need to be made, and so they can tee those up for ministers. We envision that the TPP ministers will be getting together soon. You may ask me when, and the answer is it has not been scheduled. We will need to see what type of progress our negotiators make, and so we can choose the appropriate and right time for our ministers to get together. Getting back to kind of our bilateral relationship, I think once we complete the TPP, the US and Australia can work closely together to try and bring new members on to TPP, including Korea, where we both now have free trade agreements, but also the Philippines and other ASEAN countries as well as others. But we also recognize that TPP is not the only game in town, and that we need to keep in mind that as we're negotiating TPP, that our other partners in the region, including TPP partners, are engaged in concluding trade agreements. Australia in particular has been quite active, concluding 3 free trade agreements in recent months with Japan, Korea, and China. And for me, having spent a great deal of my quarter-century career at USTR negotiating with these countries, I understand what a tremendous accomplishment this has been for Australia. Australia is also a member of the RCEP negotiations, along with 6 other TPP members, which I understand just completed its 7th round of negotiations and will meet again in the spring. We don't see any of these negotiations as mutually exclusive, but we do strongly believe that the high standards of TPP is the best way to go, and one that best reflects the 21st century issues as well as US values. And further, we believe that once the agreement is completed with the 12, that others will seriously contemplate joining. And we encourage Australia to press hard for high standards in these and other negotiations as well. Our ability to press other countries in the region to adopt high standard TPP commitments will in part depend on our demonstrating that we see these as fundamental to our future vision of the region. Allow me to conclude with a quotation from the president when he visited Brisbane last November for the G20 meetings. And he said, "Australia really is everything you want in an ally. We're cut from the same cloth. We're immigrants from an old world who built a new nation. And we share that same spirit of confidence and optimism that the future is ours to make." And I would say that's, just to conclude, that's really evident on the economic front, whether it be in the WTO, whether it be in APEC, whether it be in implementing our bilateral agreement or working on TPP, the close and deep relationship we have with Australia, and really the optimism, and I would add the good humor that they bring to these negotiations really makes it a pleasure to work with our Australian counterparts most of the time.
That's really nice.
We look and we really look forward to continuing that cooperation, particularly in the end game of the TPP negotiations, where a close relationship between the U.S. and Australia is really vital. Thank you.
Thank you. That's excellent. Now, Wendy, you mentioned, and Kim, you implied some new energy in town here in Washington around the political discussion about trade and specifically trade in general and TPP specifically. Maybe I'll start with you, Kim, because I saw you tweeted yesterday that you were up on the Hill with Senator Wyden, so that's public record. What do you see? I mean, you're engaging key members of the Senate and House. Have the politics of trade started to change in Washington?
Yes, but this is a complex town, and it's a sort of real fighting town. And one of the things I respect as a fellow who's served a long time in Australian politics, I respect enormously members of the Senate and the House of Representatives. In Australia, we operate a Westminster system, and we can hide behind party and caucus. That's of enormous benefit when you're individually confronting your constituents. When you have a constituency that understands when you say, well, look, Fred, I tried really hard to get this matter up at the last caucus meeting, but they didn't agree with me, and of course I'm therefore bound to vote with them when the matter comes before the Parliament. The average Australian constituent will understand that completely. They won't like it, but they live with it. You can't do this in the United States. There is nowhere to hide for an American congressman or senator, nowhere. So I have real respect for those who are prepared to take a step forward on something which is controversial. I think there is a real will in Congress to do something, but that will, to a degree, is countered by the weight of effort out there to block them, to argue special cases, to argue propositions which you know are showstoppers, but seem to there to be a reasonable explanation to the public that really you're for something when you know very well that what you're for is going to destroy what you say you're going to be for. And so this is, I mean, the American congressmen swim on trade matters in a sea of crocodiles, and they are really, it's going to be really tough for them. But I would say this, that having been here for 5 years now, there's no doubt in my mind that the atmosphere is better for this at the moment than it's been at any time.
Did you want to comment, Wendy?
Yeah, I would just underscore that, you know, this is a really exciting time to work on trade. Both when I travel around the world now, we have a very active and busy trade agenda, but the debate in Washington too is very focused on trade. And the administration is working hard with Congress to encourage a bipartisan trade promotion authority bill to move through Congress as quickly as possible. At the same time, we are moving and working very hard to wrap up the TPP negotiations, recognizing the enormous economic and strategic benefits that they offer, and really wanting to get these benefits into place as soon as possible.
Can you talk a little bit about the politics of trade in the other countries? I mean, how do you think the members, the other, I guess since both of you are here, the other 10 members are keeping a pace with this energy, or do you see as we near the final negotiations, do you see countries under a lot of pressure, and can you talk about that a little bit?
Well, you're in the negotiations.
Yeah, I would say yes to everything that you said. But no, there is a real sense of not only momentum, but that we are in the end game.
Yeah.
And you can see this because issues, for example, that for years have not, countries have not moved on. Countries are beginning to really move on these issues, and we're really narrowing the issues. I can say in our negotiations with Japan, we've had 2 rounds of negotiations with them since their lower house election. And in each meeting with them, we are really, making significant progress. Now, that's not to say it's easy. And what we've all learned as you narrow issues, yeah, there are fewer issues, but they're really, really tough.
Yeah.
And so that's what increasingly we're focused on in the negotiations. But we sense, across the table among our 11 other trading partners, once again, a real commitment and a real urgency to trying to get this deal done as quickly as possible.
I think I absolutely agree with that. I think there's a wood for the trees argument in all countries. The US is no different from anyone else in that regard. Though constitutionally, these things manifest themselves differently in each of the societies. But the motivation, the fears, the concerns are much the same at each end of it. And that is it's very easy, particularly at this phase of the negotiations, to get bogged down on the individual difficulty that is, as Wendy says, the closest approximator to a showstopper. What's really important in this, in Australia, in the US, in Japan, Vietnam, elsewhere, is to say, what do you actually really want? We're not working here in a vacuum. There are going to be trade agreements and practices that dominate Asian trade over the course forever, and they are being negotiated now, and they will come in place. They are coming in place. This is not, the TPP is not going to find itself in a situation, well, if we don't come to a conclusion on this, then actually nothing's going to happen, so we can sit down, think again, and come to another conclusion. No, that's not going to happen. Somebody is going to determine the rules of trade in Asia. Everybody really who knows anything about it really recognises in their heart of hearts that this is the high quality thing. This is the one that actually means that the process to wealth for the burgeoning middle classes of Asia and, of course, of the other signatories in South America and Australia and the US, this is a chance to take a step forward to a substantial capacity for prosperity. And that's not that you won't be prosperous. You will be. But you won't be as prosperous as you would be, and it won't have the longevity and the sustainability and the sense of equity unless you have something like the TPP rules. So this is I actually think, and Wendy might disagree with it, I actually think it's more important to the United States even than any of the other countries. Because you see, the United States knows that. It lives that. It's had that in its mind, those sorts of things in their minds as they struggled against the perversion of international trade by imperial preference. So it's there in the American genes. Others know it too. But if this does not succeed, it will be a very bad day for the principles of international trade that the United States has struggled for a century.
Well said. I have one more question before I go to the audience, and that's when we started these negotiations, or more precisely, when the United States joined, there was a lot of talk about China feeling not included, or that this was somehow an economic version of containment. But that narrative seems to have changed. Would you agree? And where do you think China stands on TPP now?
Yeah, the narrative definitely has changed.
Yeah.
And I think part of the reason it changed, and part of the reason this agreement got a lot more attention in the region, was after Japan joined. And once Japan joined, you had the two large economies in the region, with the other TPP countries representing 40% of GDP. This agreement just took on a whole new dimension in the region. And we did see in the press, but also in our conversations with China, a real change in attitude and change in perception about the TPP. We have been updating China on the negotiations during our various meetings with China. And they seem genuinely interested in what's going on in the agreement, and also interested in the substance of what we're negotiating as well. And so we look forward to continuing to update China, as well as other countries that are not part of TPP. And we think that is important, because TPP it's not about keeping certain countries out of TPP. It's basically an agreement of like-minded countries that came together because they wanted to. And so it's not like an exclusive club where either you're invited or you're not invited. It's really a group of countries, once again, coming together, wanting to achieve a high standards agreement, and wanting to really set the rules for the Asia-Pacific region for the foreseeable future.
Kim, what's your perspective?
Look, when I came here, I've got this 5-year perspective. There's no doubt at all the Chinese were hostile to it. They had they bracketed it with a whole range of practices that they saw as part of a strategy of encirclement. All this sort of the concerns that they have as a rising power, wondering how other powers are going to relate to it, and whether or not the global system and the regional system, more particularly, can produce outcomes that accord both with their interests and their status. They have changed substantially, and that is obvious. They don't conduct conversations like that anymore. Whatever might appear in the press from time to time, that is not part of the structure of a Chinese discussion with us on these sorts of arrangements. There is no doubt at all, as shrewd players and as people who understand they've benefited enormously from the economic system put in place at Bretton Woods and subsequently, that the rules of the road need to be understood, and if they're good quality rules of the road, you actually have to adjust to it. So I would say that if this is successfully negotiated, over the next decade you'll see various countries finding themselves in a position to sign up to it, and one of them will be China.
Excellent. Let me open the floor for questions. Tom?
Thank you. I'm Tom Redford with the Malaysia America Society. And I'd like to follow up on one of Ernie's questions about the politics of negotiating in some of the TPP countries, specifically Canada, Mexico, and yes, Malaysia.
Politics.
I mean, all TPP countries are facing political challenges as we try to conclude this deal. Each country has sensitivities, and their other trading partners are asking them to move on them. Many countries have very active legislatures and active stakeholders, vocal stakeholders, and so they are facing political challenges in their country. certain TPP countries, this negotiation is going on for 5 years. Almost all these TPP countries have had elections during that time, and that also faces challenges. But what's so, I think, special about TPP, or what makes it, so important, is that we've been able to, all the countries, to kind of make it through these political challenges, to focus on the negotiations, to focus on our goal, and to keep trying to move forward and to build on the momentum that has been achieved in the negotiations.
Look, the politics in each country are fraught in its own different ways, and there's forces for and against in most of the negotiating partners to this agreement, and most of them have capacities to see that democratically expressed. So there's the day-to-day media coverage will be of the opposition. There's in the main. There's no doubt about that. So sometimes you're going to get quite frightened by that, or worried, or depressed, or whatever. These countries signed up honourably. They signed up on the basis that they wanted to sit down with the rest of us and do a high-quality deal. Everyone who signed it, both those three and the others who are party to it, understood really at the end of the day this would probably run into its greatest difficulties, not on the 21st century components of the agreement, but the 20th century. It's the old agenda on market access that really creates the problems, because there are well-founded interest groups around a lot of those issues in every country. And those interest groups, some will be dead opposed to a global free trade system and be highly protectionist. Some of them will actually be supportive but want advantage. And there's no difference in those countries and the domestic experience of the US and of Australia. Slightly different in the case of the US is that as often happens in these situations, once the US is in it, it has to be the driver. It sort of is like a magnet that attracts filings to it. So it tends to be what starts out as a sort of across-the-board table becomes a table that sort of starts to concentrate itself to the roast turkey in the middle. It's not to say the US is a roast turkey, but and everybody, when they start to develop their criticisms, in the end make it a point not a criticism of doing business with somebody else, but of doing business with the US. So it's that US, which puts an enormous burden on the American negotiators. Keep the thing going in all these circumstances. The situation in the countries you name is no different from that in the others.
If I can just add to that, I agree that there are a number of market access issues in particular that really strike on core sensitivities in certain TPP partners. But also, if you take a step back, some of these 21st century rules are also causing concern in countries as well, because in many ways we're writing trade rules in areas that have not been subject to trade rules. So whether it's state-owned enterprises, or how we're going to deal with changes in the digital economy, or even how we're going to deal with wildlife trafficking in a trade agreement, all of these issues are issues that are really important to the TPP, make it a 21st century agreement, and also in certain cases lead to either opposition or concern at home. And part of the concern is just the unknown. And some of the discussions we have in TPP is trying to kind of work through putting rules on these new areas and the challenges that it presents. And also, just from a bureaucratic perspective, the different kind of ministries and the different interests that are now being increasingly brought into a trade negotiation.
We have a question from Twitter, and I just wanted to honor that. Peter Davidson from somewhere asked if, hi Peter, if you how do you differentiate the TPP from other FTAs and the GATT? It's sort of a, do you differentiate it, or is it an extension of those?
Well, I would, and I would differentiate really in the areas that Wendy was just talking about.
Okay.
It is addressing issues that, generally speaking, in trade agreements, you wouldn't, certainly in bilateral ones, you wouldn't bother with. You're unlikely in a bilateral free trade agreement to talk about the character of participation in the system of state-owned enterprises, for example. There's a range of things which are being caught up in this, which are interesting in the sense that it really could well form the basis, in a way that other agreements couldn't, of an advanced, effective trading system capable of being taken out of the Asian context and rendered global. It's a WTO-style agreement of the 21st century instead of the 20th, a WTO-style agreement that could work itself back into the WTO system, and you couldn't actually say that for most of the bilateral agreements that are negotiated.
Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I would also add, we really should emphasize that it's a regional agreement, and it's about creating supply chains among the participants in the agreement, recognizing that trade, is less and less conducted, between country X and country Y, but typically products or services move around a group of countries. And what we're doing in TPP is really breaking new ground in terms of recognizing this regional component and trying to, establish a system that really facilitates trade among the participants. And of course, unlike the GATT or a multilateral agreement, this by definition is what we call a preferential trade agreement, which means that the preferences won't be provided to all countries. They will be provided to the countries that are part of the agreement.
Yeah.
Okay. One more question, right here.
Hi, Nadia Chao with the Liberty Times from Taiwan. Wendy, our economic ministers came to Washington 2 weeks ago. I think he really expressed his interest to join DPP. I wonder, for you, is there any outstanding issue that has to be resolved before the negotiation? Like a TIFA talk will be resumed this year anytime soon. For China, after China joined WTO, we still see very contentious dispute with the U.S. Even though both sides has been in that organization for a long time. So for TPP, do you think China is really ready for a totally different new trade craft? Thank you.
Okay.
Well, first let me just say more generally that the TPP countries right now are focused on working among themselves with the current 12 countries to conclude the agreement. With the entry of the last 3 countries, Canada, Mexico, and Japan, they're well integrated into the negotiation, and now we're working hard with the 12 to conclude the agreement. But as I mentioned in my remarks, we see TPP as an open platform, and we really envision other countries and economies joining TPP over time. There is a process for this, and for the United States, that has meant that we typically will conduct bilateral consultations following intense stakeholder and congressional outreach. And in our consultations with the candidate economy or country, we want to make sure that candidate understands in detail what they'll be expected to do if they join the negotiations. So kind of like there's just no surprises, that the expectations are clear. We also look to really address bilateral issues of concern. We did this with Japan, Canada, and Mexico before they joined. And that's really an important part for the United States so we can build up the domestic support for new candidates in the negotiation.
did you want to comment, Ken?
No, look, I agree with it. I think we're down to the last 12. We're very close to the end of the negotiation now. So the notions of other people joining at this point in time, we're past that. So it's going to await the conclusion of it, and then assuming that successful conclusion, it's going to be a question of how people join from that point on. You don't just simply sign a box. You would have to conduct a negotiation with the parties, and the way this would work out, very importantly, one with the United States. But all the parties operate on the assumption that given a successful outcome to those discussions, we want everybody in.
Well, we have at least another hour of discussion we could do here, but if we want these two to come back, I'm going to have to keep them on time with their schedules, even with the snow. So please join me in thanking our discussants today. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Good morning, everybody. I hope they've turned the mics on. I'm Ernie Bauer. I'm the chair for Southeast Asia Studies, and for today, wearing my other hat as director of our Pacific Partners Initiative, which looks out over U.S. policy and our relationships with Australia, New Zealand, and the Pacific. We have a great discussion today. This is part of a U.S.-Australia speaker series that was developed in concert with our friends from BHP. I think Frank Fannin and Jason are here. I hope they are. Oh, there they are. Thanks, guys, for your support. And I think the purpose of this series was to really dig deeper into the real value and grist of the U.S.-Australia relationship. That alliance is one that is really important to both our countries, and I would argue to all of the Indo-Pacific region. And today we get to talk about really the foundation, I think, a key part of that foundation, which is the economic relationship between our countries and what the United States and Australia see in terms of trade. This is the 10th anniversary, of course, of the Australia-U.S. Free Trade Agreement. That's a very important benchmark, and I hope our discussants will talk a little bit about that. And of course, we're in the midst of negotiating a new trade agreement, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, or TPP, and we have the two incredible advocates for that trade agreement with us here. Let me introduce our guest. Wendy Cutler is the acting deputy U.S. trade representative. Wendy's worked with USTR for about a quarter of a century. She is the woman. Sorry, Wendy. Does 25 years sound better? Look, it's by way of saying that Wendy, when it comes to Asian trade, I think I've always thought of one of the areas in the U.S. government where powerful women have been ahead of their time is trade, and Wendy is one of those. She is probably the woman when it comes to trade in Asia, and really have appreciated her work and her tireless commitment to those efforts. And on my right is Kim Beazley. He's the Australian ambassador to the United States. His tour has been extended here, and that's a great thing for.
Is how terrific it is to be here, and to thank you for the enormous work that you do in focusing this town on the areas where America now needs to be most heavily concerned, and which I describe as the sunny uplands of American possibilities. The one area of the globe which is both wealthy, is growing fast, and loves Americans. And it's nice to have a part of the globe where you can say that happens to be the case. And bound up in all of that, of course, is the economic relationship and the various manifestations of it and trading arrangements. And this is part of your speakers series that you've negotiated with BHP Billiton, and that's terrific for us. It's a great thing for BHP to have, the big Australian, to have got in behind. Big Australian, has to be said, does with its partners 25% of the oil out of the Gulf, and is the largest foreign investor in unconventional energy in this country. So they're good spots. And to appear with Wendy is a bit of a legend from USTR. I didn't know much about USTR when I came here as an ambassador, because my relationships in ministerial life had been with the Pentagon in the first instance and the State Department after that. They're different sort of Americans in USTR. They're the ones who carry the bad messages and the hard messages, and they really do defend the American national interest extremely well. But at the same time, they have, like most Americans, a sense of global responsibility, so they do temper their views with that understanding of what America's global role now is. I think we'd have to count the bilateral agreement. This is the 10th anniversary, as Ernie said, of the bilateral agreement that we established for free trade between Australia and the United States. It would have to be in the minds, I think, of just about anybody who has looked at American trade policies over the years and trade outcomes. It has to be just about the most successful agreement that the United States has negotiated, when you look at the outcomes that have been associated with it. It was an agreement that was based upon a very strong public sentiment between the countries, and at that point of time, a very close relationship between the leadership of Australia and the leadership of the United States. We're always asked when we're in jobs like mine, and particularly if we have a political background like I do, you know, who represents the closest?
The relationship, we really, talking with Kim at any time is like getting it's fun, but it's also like getting a university lecture at a PhD level, I mean, on the history and the purpose behind our relationship. So you're in for a treat today. Kim has been ambassador here since, I think, 2010. He came on a day that looked pretty much like today, or a week that looked pretty much like today in February in 2010. So without further ado, let's kick it off. I hope, audience, that I want to thank the hardy souls that made it through the inch or so of snow. That's major snow for those of you in Boston. Sorry, but that's major snow for Washington. We have a full room, and I know that the online audience today is especially big. So thank you all for joining us. I hope you'll send in your questions if you're virtual via Twitter, and for those of you in the room, I hope you'll participate actively. So Kim, why don't we kick off with you, and what's on your mind in the context that we just...
Well, what's on my mind, Ernie, is you describing me as an incredible representative for Australia. I hope it would be credible. But the other thing that's on my mind is